The morning my life ended, the coffee on my desk went cold before I could drink it. I remember watching the steam rise and disappear, thinking I would get to it in a moment, thinking I had time. I had spent 5 years thinking I had time. Time to build something permanent. Time to become someone who could not be easily discarded. Time to prove that a girl who had grown up in other people's houses, sleeping in other people's beds, eating at other people's tables, could make something that was entirely and irrevocably her own. I was wrong about all of it. My name is Clara Ashworth. I was 28 years old and a senior accountant at Morrison and Grant, one of Houston's oldest financial consulting firms. I had been there since I was 23, fresh out of a state university on a scholarship that had required me to maintain a grade point average. I had no margin to let slip. I had worked every weekend of my first 2 years. I had stayed past midnight more times than I could count. I had learned the particular language of a firm like Morrison and Grant. The careful way you spoke to partners, the careful way you did not speak at all unless spoken to, the way you made yourself indispensable without ever making yourself visible enough to become a threat. I had been good at it, better than good. 3 weeks before the morning the coffee went cold, I had found something in the senior partner's accounts that did not belong there. Discrepancies at first, numbers that did not add up in ways that might have been careless bookkeeping if they had appeared once or twice. But they appeared in patterns, transfers that moved money in directions that served no legitimate business purpose. A structure that anyone with 5 years of forensic accounting training would recognize immediately. I recognized it immediately. I did what I believed was right. I documented everything carefully the way I had been trained to document everything carefully, and I reported it through the proper internal channels because I believed that was what the proper internal channels existed for. I believed that honesty was a value the firm held, not merely a word they printed in the employee handbook. I believed that doing the right thing still meant something in a world that claimed to reward it. I was 28 years old, and I had been naive for every single one of those years without knowing it. The senior partner kept his corner office in his seven-figure year-end bonus. I received a cardboard box in 15 minutes to clear my desk. The official reason was violation of confidentiality protocols, a phrase precise enough to be legally defensible and vague enough to mean absolutely anything. What it meant in practice was that I had made powerful people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people make decisions that protect themselves. The fluorescent lights in the conference room buzzed overhead while my manager spoke. I watched his mouth form words and felt the sound arrive separately from the meaning, as though my mind was refusing to process both at the same time. 5 years. Effective immediately. We wish you well. The leather chair I sat in was the same chair I had sat in for every performance review, every commendation, every meeting where I had been told I was an asset, told I was valued, told the firm was lucky to have someone with my attention to detail. The chair had not changed. Everything else had. I walked through the office carrying the cardboard box, and the faces I passed turned away as I approached them. People I had shared lunches with, people I had helped through their own difficult quarters, their own late nights, their own moments of uncertainty. They found their computer screens fascinating. They discovered urgent tasks that required their immediate and complete attention. The silence was a specific kind of cruelty, the kind that comes not from malice, but from self-preservation, and I understood it even as it gutted me. Into the box went a coffee mug with a chip on the handle that I had never gotten around to replacing. A small cactus I had kept alive for 4 years through a combination of neglect and stubbornness. A framed certificate of excellence that had hung on my cubicle wall long enough to leave a pale rectangle on the fabric behind it, a ghost of something I had once been proud of. I put it in the box face down. The elevator doors closed and I caught my reflection in the polished metal. A woman in a gray suit that had somehow become too large for her in the 15 minutes since her life ended. Blonde hair in the professional ponytail I had worn every day for 5 years. Eyes that looked like rooms with the furniture removed. I walked out into Houston's summer air, thick enough to chew, and stood on the sidewalk with my cardboard box and no particular direction to walk in. The drive back to my apartment took 20 minutes, and I do not remember most of it. The Houston skyline shrank in my rearview mirror, and I watched it go the way you watch something disappear when you are not yet certain you will not need it again. All those buildings full of people with purposes, with paychecks, with reasons to set an alarm for tomorrow morning. My apartment was a one-bedroom on the fourth floor of a building that aspired to look expensive without committing to the expense. $1,400 a month for thin walls and a parking lot view, and the comfort of knowing that civilization existed 12 feet beyond my window. I had chosen it for its proximity to the office. I had chosen it because I had never imagined needing anything more than a place to exist between working hours. The lease expired in 2 weeks. I sat on the floor that evening because the couch seemed too far away, and I opened my banking application and I looked at the number for a long time without it changing. $612. Not enough for 1 month's rent, let alone a deposit on a new place. My credit cards were at their limits from the professional certification courses I had taken the previous year. Investing in my own value to a company that had just demonstrated my value was zero. I scrolled through my phone contacts looking for someone to call. The list was short, painfully, humiliatingly short. Former colleagues who would now avoid my calls to protect their own positions. A foster care caseworker I had not spoken to since aging out of the system at 18. A former roommate in Seattle who had not responded to my last 2 messages. I was 28 years old and I had never felt more like the 4-year-old girl who had stood in a hospital hallway while strangers sorted out what to do with her. My mother died when I was 4. A car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside Austin. The kind of loss that arrives without warning and reorganizes everything that comes after it. She had been driving home from a nursing shift. A semi-truck crossed the median. The police officer described it as instantaneous, as though that were a mercy, as though the speed of a thing determined its weight. I have 3 memories of her, and I have never been entirely certain they are real and not constructed from the photographs I studied so obsessively as a child that they became indistinguishable from experience. The smell of lavender, which I encounter in grocery store aisles and hotel lobbies, and it stops me every time, just for a moment, just long enough to feel 4 years old again and entirely safe. A laugh that filled whatever room she was in, not the sound of it exactly, but the feeling it created, a feeling of rightness, of being exactly where I was supposed to be. And her hand around mine, warm and certain, walking somewhere I cannot remember. Only the sensation of small fingers held inside larger ones, of being tethered to someone who had no intention of letting go. After that was a system. Foster homes that ranged from adequate to forgettable. Families who meant well or did not mean much at all, stretched thin, or simply unprepared for a quiet child who had learned early that needing things too visibly led to disappointment. I moved 7 times before I turned 12. Each move taught me the same lesson with increasing clarity. Do not get attached. Do not expect permanence. Keep your things organized because you will need to pack them again soon. I chose accounting because numbers are honest. They do not promise things they cannot deliver. They do not leave in the middle of the night. They do not look away when you walk past carrying a cardboard box. I built my entire adult life around the safety of things that could be verified, quantified, relied upon. And now I sat on the floor of an apartment I could not afford to keep, and the number in my banking application would not cooperate with the life I had tried to build around it. The email arrived on the 3rd day. I was sitting cross-legged on my apartment floor with my laptop balanced on a stack of accounting textbooks, scrolling through job listings the way a drowning person scans the surface for something to hold on to. The positions I was qualified for barely covered rent. The positions that paid what I needed wanted references from employers who would now describe me as a liability. The subject line read, "Regarding the estate of Eleanor Voss." I almost deleted it. The name meant nothing to me, and I had grown careful about anything that presented itself as an opportunity. Hope, in my experience, had a habit of being the first step in a longer fall. But something made me open it. Curiosity, maybe. Or the particular desperation of someone with nowhere else to look. The email was from Raymond Holt, attorney at law practicing in Ridge Creek, Montana. He wrote in the measured, unhurried sentences of a man who had spent his life in a place where words were chosen carefully because they carried distance. He informed me that I had been named the sole beneficiary in the last will and testament of Eleanor Voss, who had passed away on November 22nd of the previous year. Eleanor had left me her property, including a cabin, in 47 acres of land adjacent to Whitewater Falls in the Bitterroot Mountains. There were no financial obligations attached beyond minimal transfer fees of approximately $2,000. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time. Eleanor Voss. I searched every corner of my memory and found nothing. No distant relative mentioned in passing. No family friend from my mother's life. No explanation for why a woman in Montana I had never heard of would leave me everything she owned. The email included a phone number. I stared at it for a long time. This was either a sophisticated scam or a mistake so specific it bordered on the surreal. People did not inherit cabins from strangers. That was not how life worked, not for girls who had counted foster placements the way other children counted birthday candles. But what did I have to lose? I called the number. Raymond Holt answered on the second ring. His voice was exactly what his email had suggested. Unhurried, considered. The voice of a man who had delivered unexpected news many times and understood that the most important thing in such moments was not to rush. I told him I did not know anyone named Eleanor Voss. I told him I had never been to Montana. I told him there must be some mistake. There is no mistake, he said. Ms. Voss was very specific. She spent considerable effort locating you. She hired a private investigator, he explained in March of last year, shortly after receiving her cancer diagnosis. It had taken 8 months to find me through my professional licensing records, the paper trail I had created by building the legitimate, verifiable, accountable life I had believed would protect me. Eleanor had completed her will 2 weeks before she died. Her only regret, Raymond told me, was that she had not had enough time to contact me directly. Why, I asked. My voice did not sound like mine. Raymond paused. I could hear him choosing his words with the same care he gave his sentences, the creak of an old chair, the shuffle of papers being set aside. He said that Eleanor had believed she owed a debt to my mother, that she had been searching for Catherine Ashworth's daughter for a very long time, and had wanted to ensure I would have something she believed my mother would have wanted me to have. My mother's name in a stranger's mouth. The shock of it traveled through me like cold water finding every crack. What did she know about my mother, I asked. He did not know the details, he said. He was her attorney, not her confidant. But she had left instructions. She said I would understand when I arrived. She said the cabin would explain what she could not. I should have asked more questions. I should have been cautious and methodical and protective of the $612 I had left to my name. Instead, I asked one question. How soon can I be there? The Greyhound from Houston to Ridge Creek, Montana, took 27 hours with transfers in Dallas, Denver, and Missoula. 27 hours in vinyl seats that stuck to the backs of my legs through rest stops, that all carried the same smell of industrial cleaner and stale coffee, watching the landscape outside my window transform with a slowness that felt deliberate. Texas gave itself up reluctantly. The flat certainty of Houston surrendered first to the rolling land around Austin, where I had been born, without knowing it would matter, and then to the long emptiness of West Texas, where the horizon stretched until it seemed to bend with the earth itself. I watched oil derricks nodding in the distance and thought about all the things people would do for what lay beneath the surface of an ordinary-looking piece of ground. Colorado arrived like an argument for beauty I had not known I needed to hear. Mountains rose from the plains with a confidence that demanded response. Their peaks were still white with late-season snow, catching a quality of light I had never seen in Houston, a light that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. I pressed my face to the window without caring how it looked. I had spent my entire life in flat places, places where you could see trouble coming from a long way off, which turned out not to matter if you could not outrun it anyway. These mountains offered something different in the looking. Shelter. The suggestion that a person might find within their angles and their shadows a place that could not be easily surveyed from above. Montana announced itself just after dawn on the second day, and I watched the light find valleys so green they seemed impossible rivers I could not name moving through forests that had clearly been standing long before anyone thought to give them names. The towns grew smaller and further apart. The billboards disappeared. The world outside my window became something older and less apologetic with every passing mile. Ridge Creek announced itself with a hand-painted sign that had survived several decades in multiple repaintings. Population 3,247. The number felt like an aspiration based on what I could see from the bus window. A main street with a hardware store, its windows displaying tools, whose purposes I could only partly guess. A diner with red vinyl booths visible through plate glass and a neon sign reading, Maze with a burned-out apostrophe that no one had gotten around to fixing. A Baptist church with a white steeple that caught the morning light with the quiet confidence of something that had been catching morning light in the same spot for 100 years. A general store with a wooden porch that sagged in the middle from decades of boots crossing and recrossing the same boards. The kind of town where strangers were noticed immediately and evaluated carefully. I stepped off the bus into air that was nothing like Houston air. Cleaner and thinner and sharper with pine, and the cold memory of a winter that had not entirely finished with the valley. The mountains rose on all sides, and for a moment the beauty of it felt indistinguishable from being trapped a box with exceptional scenery. Raymond Holt was waiting beside an old pickup truck, and he was exactly what his voice had promised. Tall and lean, silver-haired, wire-rimmed glasses that suggested a man who had read many books and held on to most of what they contained. 71 years old, I would learn later. A law practice he had run alone from an office above the hardware store for 4 decades. He shook my hand with a grip that was firm without performing firmness, helped my suitcase into the truck bed, and said he was glad I had come. He had already given me the keys at his office, 3 pieces of metal on a simple ring worn smooth with years of handling cold against my palm, in the way that objects hold the memory of the spaces they have lived in. He had placed them in my hand without ceremony, the way you hand over something that has been waiting for its owner, and said only Eleanor asked that you take your time, that you read what she left before making any decisions. We drove to his office first, where I signed documents. I read more carefully than he might have expected the habit of 5 years of forensic accounting not yet stripped away. Transfer of deed, acknowledgement of inheritance, acceptance of responsibility for the property in its condition. My signature felt strange on pages that were changing the shape of my life in ways I could not yet measure. The property is about 12 miles outside of town, Raymond told me as I signed the final page. The cabin has been unoccupied since Eleanor passed in November. It will need work. The winter was hard and she was not able to maintain things as she once had during her final months. He paused, polishing his glasses with the deliberate care of a man who used the gesture to buy himself time to choose his next words. But the bones are solid. She built it to last. Rebuilt it, really. The structure was already standing when she arrived in 1982, but she spent years strengthening it, learning what she needed to learn to do it properly. She understood construction better than most contractors in this county. Self-taught mostly. She was a biology teacher by training, but she learned whatever she needed to know to survive out there alone. She lived there alone, I said, for 40 years. Mostly by choice, though I suspect the choice grew harder as the years went on. He looked at me with something that might have been concern or assessment or both. She was a private woman. Kept to herself mostly, though she helped a great many people in this community over the years in ways she rarely took credit for. She was content, I think, or as content as a person can be when they are carrying something they cannot share. We drove the winding road toward Whitewater Falls through a forest that grew denser as the paved road gave way to gravel, which gave way to packed dirt. The truck bounced through ruts left by snow melt and spring rain. Ancient pines rose on both sides, their tops lost in a haze that had nothing to do with pollution and everything to do with altitude and the particular quality of mountain air in early spring. Then I heard it before I saw it. A sound that started as a low rumble somewhere at the edge of perception and grew until it was no longer background noise, but the defining feature of the air itself. Water striking stone with a force that had been accumulating in the mountains above, and now released itself with a complete indifference to anything I might be feeling or needing or fearing. I felt it in my chest before I understood what it was. A second heartbeat, slower and more certain than mine. Raymond rounded a final curve and the world opened up. The cabin stood in a clearing, and my first thought was that it had not been built there so much as grown there over time. Cedar siding weathered to a silver gray that matched the color of old photographs. A porch that wrapped around two sides, sagging in places where the winters had been unkind, but the bones of it still true. Windows that needed cleaning but caught the late afternoon light anyway, holding it like something worth keeping. And behind it all, the waterfall. A cascade of white water dropping 40 feet over black volcanic rock, throwing mist into the air that caught the light and made rainbows that appeared and vanished and appeared again with the shifting of the wind. The sound of it filled the entire clearing. There was no corner of this space that was not inside that sound. It was the most beautiful place I had ever seen in my life. It was absolutely terrifying. "Everything inside belongs to you now," Raymond said. "Eleanor asked that you take your time, that you read what she left before making any decisions." "What kind of decisions?" I asked. He smiled, and there was something in the smile that held more than he was saying. The expression of a man who had been asked to keep a confidence and intended to keep it. "About whether you want to stay." He climbed back into the pickup. I watched the truck disappear around the curve, and then I was standing alone in a clearing in Montana with a waterfall thundering behind me and three rusted keys in my hand and no idea what I had just agreed to. The first night was the longest of my life. I had believed I understood loneliness. I had built an entire adult identity around the management of it, around the conversion of isolation into self-sufficiency, around the principle that needing less made you stronger, because needing less meant fewer ways to be hurt. I had lived alone in Houston for 5 years. I had eaten dinners by myself at a kitchen table and called it independence, and believed the word. This was different in ways I had not prepared for. The waterfall was the first thing. I had imagined it would be soothing, the white noise of running water that sleep apps tried to replicate for insomniacs in urban apartments. The reality was something else entirely. The waterfall was not a background. It was everything. It was the total sound environment of this place, inescapable in every room. And at 2 in the morning, with no lights visible in any direction, and no signal on my phone, and the cabin settling around me in sounds I did not yet know how to interpret, the waterfall was not soothing. It was a reminder, continuous and indifferent, that I was alone in a way I had never actually been alone before. No traffic sounds to confirm that civilization existed nearby. No distant sirens suggesting that help was somewhere within reach. No hum of a neighbor's television through the wall. No notification on a phone that had not found a signal since we left the main road. Just water and darkness, and the sounds a 60-year-old cabin makes when the temperature drops after sunset. I lay on the cabin's narrow bed, which had a mattress that smelled of cedar and thyme, and I stared at a ceiling I could not see and thought about the $612 I had spent most of getting here. Thought about the apartment lease running out in 2 weeks with no forwarding address. Thought about the job listings I had left open on my laptop screen in Houston, the positions that wanted experience I did not have, and references I could not provide. What had I done? The second night was worse because the novelty had worn away, and what remained was the reality of my situation in its undecorated form. The cabin had electricity, but it was unreliable, the lights flickering during the wind that moved through the valley in unpredictable surges. The water from the tap ran brown for the first several minutes each morning, the pipes expressing their long disuse in the particular language of old plumbing. The ancient wood-burning stove in the kitchen required a knowledge I did not have, and I ate crackers and peanut butter for dinner by the light of a flashlight app on a phone that was showing 11% battery. I told myself this was an adventure. I told myself this was a beginning. I told myself that a person who had survived 7 foster placements and a state university on a scholarship and 5 years of 70-hour work weeks could certainly figure out how to work a wood stove. I did not entirely believe any of it. The sixth night brought weather I had no frame of reference for. I had seen Houston thunderstorms. I understood what it meant for the sky to open up for lightning, to work the horizon like something with an argument to make. But this was different in a way that was difficult to describe except to say that mountain storms do not merely happen to the landscape. They originate in it. The clouds that came down off the peaks that evening moved like something alive and purposeful, and the air changed quality before a single drop fell thickening, acquiring an electrical charge I could feel in the back of my teeth. The sky went from afternoon light to a bruised darkness in under 15 minutes. Then the wind arrived, not gradually but all at once, hitting the cabin like a hand pressed flat against every surface, simultaneously finding gaps I had not known existed, making the fire in the wood stove I had finally figured out gutter and surge. Outside, the trees bent at angles that seemed to negotiate with physics rather than comply with it. And the waterfall doubled in sound, then tripled the rain, feeding it from above, while the thunder moved through the valley in waves that I felt in my sternum. I stood at the window and watched the world dissolve into white water and gray, and realized something that sat in my chest like a stone. No one knew exactly where I was. Raymond Holt had my address, but Raymond Holt was 12 miles away in a town of 3,000 people who did not know my name. There was no one else, not a single person on the contact list of my phone who would raise an alarm if I did not appear somewhere by a certain day. If something happened to me in this cabin on this night, the discovery of it would not be a matter of hours or even days. I sat near the wood stove and held my flashlight with both hands and thought about my mother. I wondered if she had ever felt this alone. Wondered if there had been nights in her life when she had sat in some dark place and questioned the sequence of choices that had led her there. Wondered what she would say to me if she could see me now, 28 years old, sitting in a stranger's cabin in Montana, while a mountain storm tried to take the roof with no job and no plan and $600 to my name. I think she would have told me to keep looking, to stay until I understood what I had come here to find. I held on to that thought, and somewhere between midnight and 4 in the morning, the storm exhausted itself and I fell asleep in the chair by the stove. I woke to a silence that was not empty. The storm had passed, and in its wake, the valley held a quality of stillness that was different from the absence of sound. It was a fullness of a particular kind, the way a room feels after a long conversation rather than before one. Even the waterfall seemed to have found a lower register, as though the night's performance had been followed by something gentler. I stepped out onto the sagging porch and stopped moving. The clearing was transformed. Every surface carried rain that the morning sun was converting to mist, and the mist caught the light at angles that produced rainbows overlapping each other across the entire width of the clearing. Colors so clean they looked painted. The forest beyond the clearing was a green. I did not have an accurate name for a green that seemed to come from inside the trees rather than from the light touching their surfaces. The black rock behind the waterfall was sheened with moisture and caught the early light in ways that made it look both older and more alive than rock had any right to look. I stood on the porch and watched, not analyzing, not planning, not managing the experience the way I manage most experiences, turning them into data, into information, into something I could file and reference and use. Just watching, just letting it be what it was without trying to decide what it meant. Something loosened in my chest that I had not known was tight. I was still broke, still unemployed, still standing on a porch 12 miles from the nearest town with no clear path forward. None of those facts had changed, but I was also still standing, still breathing air that tasted like nothing I had breathed in Houston, still here, which was more than I had been certain of at 2 in the morning, with the storm pressing against every window. That morning, I decided to stop waiting for answers to come to me. I started with the bookshelves, running my fingers along the spines, the way I had learned to run my fingers along the columns of a financial statement, looking for the thing that did not fit the anomaly, the number that broke the pattern. Biology texts, ecology studies, local history of the Bitterroot Valley, field guides for birds and plants and the mushrooms of the Northern Rockies, books about water management, about sustainable agriculture, about the history of the people who had lived in this valley long before European settlers arrived and renamed everything they found. Books about grief and about recovery, and about the slow work of rebuilding a self after a loss that changes the fundamental coordinates. The annotations in the margins were careful and slanting questions, written in blue ink connections, drawn between ideas across different pages. A mind that had spent 40 years alone in this valley, continuing to work to ask to wonder. Who had this woman been? What had she known about my mother? Why had she spent 4 decades in deliberate isolation beside a waterfall, when the evidence of her intelligence and capability suggested she could have been anywhere, done anything? I pulled books from shelves and checked behind them, found nothing but pressed wildflowers fragile with age, and the occasional handwritten index card tucked between pages. I went through the kitchen drawers, checked the backs of cabinet doors, moved through the bedroom with its nightstand still holding Eleanor's reading glasses and a cardigan still draped over the chairback as though she had simply stepped outside. I was about to start over from the beginning when I noticed the rug. It was old and braided and oval in colors that had once been vibrant and had surrendered to time in the particular light of a south-facing window. I had walked across it dozens of times without registering it as anything other than a floor covering. But the morning light was hitting it at an angle that exposed something I had not noticed before. One side of it sat slightly higher than the other. Not dramatically, not in a way that would catch anyone's eye who was not already looking. But the rug was not lying flat against the floor. Something beneath it was preventing it from lying flat. I crossed the room and pulled the rug aside. Beneath it was a trap door. A simple wooden hatch set flush with the flooring secured with a latch that showed evidence of decades of use, but had been kept carefully against rust. Not a cellar door. The placement was wrong for that in the middle of the main room rather than in a corner or against a wall. This was something deliberate, something positioned to be hidden by a rug that no one would think to look beneath, something meant to be found only by someone willing to look. I stood there for a moment with my heart doing something it did not usually do. Then I retrieved my flashlight from the kitchen counter and went back and lifted the latch and pulled the hatch open. A ladder descended into cool darkness. The smell that came up to meet me was earth and cedar and something else I could not name immediately, the smell of a space that had been sealed and preserved, that held within its air the compressed presence of years. Not stale exactly, more like a library that had been closed for a long time, like accumulated thought waiting to be released. I put my foot on the first rung. The space below was small, 8 feet by 10 perhaps, with a ceiling low enough that I had to bend my head slightly. But it was not empty and it was not neglected. The walls on 3 sides were lined with shelves that had been built with the same care that characterized everything else I had found in this cabin. And the shelves were full. Leather-bound notebooks, dozens of them, arranged in order along the shelves with the precision of someone who had understood that order was a form of respect for the things being stored. Each spine was labeled in the same slanting handwriting I had seen in the margins of the books upstairs, a date range in blue ink, the earliest going back to March of 1982. I stood in the cool underground room and looked at 40 years of one woman's thought and observation preserved in the darkness, beneath the floor of the cabin she had spent her life in. My hands were shaking when I reached for the first one. I carried an armload of notebooks up into the light and sat down at Eleanor Voss's kitchen table and opened the first page of the earliest volume. March 15th, 1982. The handwriting was precise and controlled, but alive with the energy of someone who had finally found the thing they had been looking for without knowing they were looking for it. I came here seeking solitude. I came here to find out who I am underneath all the definitions other people have placed upon me. The first morning I walked to the falls before the sun had fully cleared the mountains, and I stood there for a very long time. The sound of it was not what I expected. It was not peaceful. It was insistent. It demanded that I pay attention. I think I will be paying attention for a long time. I sat at that table as the morning aged into afternoon, and the afternoon moved toward evening, and the light through the windows changed color 3 times. I read Eleanor Voss's careful observations of her first year in this valley, the way she had cataloged the plants and the birds, and the seasonal behavior of the waterfall itself. The way she had begun to understand the patterns of a place by watching it through every kind of weather and light. I read her notes on the book she had been reading, the connection she had been drawing between traditional ecological knowledge and the landscape she was learning to inhabit. Then I found the entry from June of 1983 that changed the register of everything. I went back to the Western clearing today she had written, the one I first noticed in April. I have been back 7 times now, and every time I am more certain that what I am seeing is not natural. The channels in the rock are too consistent for erosion. The pattern of them makes no hydraulic sense if they occurred randomly. Someone made these. Someone made these with a specific and sophisticated purpose in mind. Someone understood this water and this land in ways that I am only beginning to appreciate. She called it the living grid. I put the notebook down and looked out the window at the forest that began 50 feet beyond the porch railing. And I understood in the particular way that you understand something when all its pieces arrive at once, that this was not a story about an inheritance. This was a story about something hidden, something protected, something worth 40 years of a woman's life, and possibly more than that offered in its protection. I picked up the next notebook and kept reading. By the time the light failed completely and the waterfall settled into its nighttime voice lower and more intimate than its daytime declaration, I had read through 6 volumes and reached the autumn of 1984. I had read Eleanor's growing understanding of what lay beneath the living grid, the aquifer she had identified, one of the largest untapped freshwater reserves in the state, filtered through centuries of rock and protected by the very system built above it. I had read her first descriptions of the company that had come to her land with survey equipment and expensive clothing and questions she had not answered. And I had found in an entry dated October 15th of that year a sentence that made the hair on my arms rise. They came back today, different men than before. They did not bother pretending to be polite. They said I was making things difficult for myself. They said I should take the money and leave before something happened that I would regret. I set the notebook on the table in Eleanor Voss's kitchen and listened to the waterfall outside. The same waterfall she had listened to for 40 years. The same water falling over the same black rock, in the same clearing, at the edge of the same mountains. The keys on the table beside me were still cold. The inheritance papers Raymond Holt had given me were folded in my jacket pocket. The trapdoor in the floor of the main room stood open like a question I had only just begun to understand how to answer. I reached for the next notebook and opened it to the first page. The notebooks consumed the next 3 days completely. I read them in the order Eleanor had written them, moving through the shelves in the underground room with the methodical attention I had once given to financial statements, except that no financial statement had ever made me forget to eat, forget to sleep, forget that the world outside the cabin windows existed and continued without my participation. These notebooks did all of those things. I read by the light of the kitchen table during the day and by flashlight when the evening came, and when my eyes grew too tired to continue, I would close the current volume and lie on the narrow bed and stare at the ceiling and think about what I had read, and then I would reach for the flashlight again. Eleanor Voss had arrived at Whitewater Falls in the spring of 1982. She was 50 years old. 32 years of teaching biology at a high school in Missoula, a career she had loved and then slowly outgrown, the way you outgrow a house that was right for an earlier version of yourself. A marriage that had ended not in drama, but in the quiet accumulation of 2 people becoming strangers while standing in the same rooms. No children. A choice she had made deliberately and revisited periodically in the journals without regret, though with a particular kind of loneliness she named honestly and did not try to dress as something else. She had found the cabin through a listing in a Missoula paper. 47 acres and a structure that needed work, priced low because of its remoteness and the condition of the access road. She had driven out alone on a Tuesday in April, stood in the clearing for 20 minutes, listening to the falls, and written a check before she drove back. She did not explain that decision in the early notebooks, not directly. But reading through the first year of her observations, the patient cataloging of the valley's seasonal rhythms, The way she had learned to read the weather from the shape of the clouds above the western peaks. The way she had begun to understand the falls as a living presence rather than a scenic feature. The reasons accumulated themselves without needing to be stated. This place had spoken to something in Eleanor Voss that had not been spoken to before. She had come seeking solitude and found something that felt in her own careful phrasing like a conversation she had been waiting her whole life to begin. The discovery of the living grid had happened gradually through the spring and summer of 1983. She had first noticed an anomaly in the western clearing a quarter-mile from the cabin where the vegetation was darker and denser than the surrounding forest in ways that the light and soil conditions alone could not explain. She had begun mapping the area on her third visit, crawling on her hands and knees through undergrowth that had accumulated over decades, brushing away layers of fallen leaves and compacted forest debris. Beneath those layers cut into the bedrock with a precision that stopped her cold, the first time she exposed a full section were channels. Stone channels carved into the landscape in patterns that were too deliberate, too geometrically consistent, too obviously purposeful to be anything other than the work of people who had understood both the topography and the hydrology of this valley with an intimacy that came from generations of observation. The channels ran outward from a central distribution point near the base of the falls, branching and rebranching in a network that spread across the valley floor in directions Eleanor spent weeks tracing before she began to understand the whole. The system directed water, not simply, not crudely, but with a sophistication she described in the notebooks with increasing admiration in what eventually became something close to reverence. The channels worked with the natural gradient of the land rather than against it, enhancing the distribution of surface water in ways that created and maintained an ecosystem far more productive than the surrounding terrain. The soil within the grid's influence was darker, richer, more deeply alive. Plants grew faster and larger. The water table in the affected area was measurably higher and more stable through drought years. She called it the living grid because it felt to her scientist mind like a system with emergent properties greater than the sum of its parts. Not magic, she wrote carefully, not mysticism, but the accumulated wisdom of people who had been paying attention to this specific place for a very long time and had translated that attention into action. The Blackfoot people had inhabited this valley for generations before European contact. Eleanor believed they had built and maintained this system over centuries, passing the knowledge of it down through generations, the way other kinds of essential knowledge were passed down as survival itself. What she found beneath the grid was what had changed everything. An aquifer. Not unusual in Montana, a state with abundant groundwater, but unusual in its scale and its purity. Filtered through centuries of volcanic rock protected from surface contamination by the very system built above it, replenished by the snowmelt that fed the falls year after year. Eleanor had hired a geologist from the University of Montana to assess it under the pretense of a general hydrological survey, and the geologist's private assessment, which Eleanor had recorded verbatim in a November 1983 notebook entry, was that the reserve was one of the largest untapped freshwater sources in the entire state, worth billions potentially to the right buyer with the right extraction equipment and the right relationships with the municipalities and agricultural operations that would pay any price for reliable water. Worth destroying an ecosystem that had survived for centuries to possess. Eleanor had understood what this meant before the company arrived. She had written about it in the winter of 1983, months before any stranger had set foot on her property. She had understood that the value of what lay beneath her land would eventually attract the kind of attention that did not ask permission and did not take no for an answer. She had begun quietly documenting everything about the grid and the aquifer and the valley's ecology with the thoroughness of someone who understood that evidence carefully preserved was the only weapon available to a person without money or political connections. She had been right about the attention arriving. She had simply underestimated how long it would persist. Mercer Resources had first appeared in September of 1984. Eleanor's description of that initial encounter was precise and unsettling. 3 men in a black car that was too clean for the access road. suits that belonged in boardrooms rather than in a mountain valley, the practiced friendliness of people accustomed to having their offers accepted. They represented a water resources company. They had been conducting surveys in the region. They had noticed unusual readings on their instruments. They made an offer of $10,000. Eleanor had declined without discussion. The offers escalated over the following months. 20,000, then 50, then legal letters suggesting that Eleanor's property boundaries might be subject to dispute attached to surveys that had been conducted on her land without her knowledge or permission. Then the more direct approaches. The power line cut on an October night with no storm to explain it, which Eleanor repaired herself over 3 days using a manual she had ordered from a hardware store in Missoula. The mailbox destroyed with a thoroughness that went well beyond accidental damage. The phone call in November from different men who had not bothered with friendliness, who had told her she was making things difficult for herself. And then the barn, January 1985. She had written about it in a hand that was steadier than I would have expected from someone who had just watched her property burn. The fire marshal's verdict of probable faulty wiring was recorded without comment. What followed it in the same measured sentences was her account of standing at the cabin window while the barn burned and watching a man she recognized from the November visit stand in the tree line smoking a cigarette, not hiding, not pretending to be a concerned neighbor who had seen the smoke, simply watching with the particular calm of someone communicating a message rather than witnessing an accident. Eleanor had watched back, and then she had sat down and written for 3 hours in the cold kitchen, filling 30 pages of a notebook with everything she knew and everything she suspected and everything she intended to do about it. She had not left. She had stayed through the 1984 campaign and through the legal battles of the 1990s when the company renamed and restructured, but recognizably the same entity with the same objectives, had engaged lawyers who cost her years of her savings and most of her retirement income, fighting in courts that struggled to understand what was actually at stake. She had stayed through the long middle years when the pressure had diminished to a watchful quiet that felt less like retreat and more like patience. She had stayed while her hair turned silver and her handwriting changed, and the world outside her valley transformed in ways she observed through books and the occasional trip to Missoula. She had stayed because leaving would mean that everything she was protecting would be destroyed by people who saw in it nothing but an extraction opportunity. And Eleanor Voss had been constitutionally incapable of allowing that to happen. On the third day of reading, I found the entry from 2020. The company has been quiet for several years, she had written. I allowed myself to believe they had moved on to easier targets. But yesterday, I saw a man I did not recognize hiking the boundary of my property with equipment I recognized as survey gear. They are back, or perhaps they never left. Perhaps they have simply been waiting. The entry that followed it 2 weeks later was shorter. I am old now. I have held them off for 36 years, but I cannot hold them off forever. I need to find another way. I need to find someone who will still be here when I am not. I set the notebook down on the kitchen table and sat very still for a moment. Then I looked out the window at the forest, at the faint path that led west toward the clearing Eleanor had first noticed on a spring afternoon in 1983, at the mountains beyond the tree line, indifferent and permanent, at the waterfall which was doing what it always did, which was fall. I went to find the living grid. The path was overgrown but legible if you knew to look for it, and Eleanor's detailed descriptions in the notebooks had given me enough landmarks to navigate by. A boulder on the left side of the path that was the precise shape and size of a sleeping bear, which I recognized immediately when I saw it and understood why she had used it as a marker. A pine tree that had been split by lightning decades ago and had survived the splitting, growing onward in 2 directions from the point of impact, making a shape like an open hand. A creek that appeared from underground ran alongside the path for 30 feet and disappeared again 3 times before finally committing to a direction. The clearing announced itself through a change in the air before I saw it. Eleanor had described this in the notebooks, and I had assumed she was being poetic. She was not. The air in the clearing was different. Not dramatically, not in any way I could have named precisely on first encounter, but perceptibly different, the way a room is different when a window has been opened. A quality of aliveness that the air did not have in the forest on either side. I knelt in the soil at the clearing center. The earth was darker than any soil I had seen in my life. A deep black-brown that held moisture visibly even in the dry weeks of early spring, the kind of soil that communicated its richness through color alone. I pushed 2 fingers into it and felt the resistance of something dense with life, layered with decades of accumulated organic material that the system above it had been creating and protecting. The plants around me were growing with an urgency that was impossible to attribute to chance. I brushed away a section of fallen leaves and found the first channel, cut into the bedrock with a precision that made my throat tighten. The edge of it was clean in a way that erosion would have softened over centuries if the grid had been abandoned. But the shape of it was still purposeful, still geometric, still recognizably the work of people who had been thinking carefully about where the water needed to go and what it needed to sustain when it arrived. I traced it with 1 finger for 2 feet before the leaves covered it again. I sat back on my heels and looked around the clearing. Beneath me, if Eleanor's documentation was accurate, lay one of the largest untapped freshwater reserves in Montana. Above me, in the form of the system I had just touched, was the reason it had remained untapped. And around me in the mountains that had been watching this valley for millions of years was the reason Eleanor Voss had spent her life here rather than somewhere easier. I understood kneeling in that clearing with dark soil under my fingernails and the sound of the falls carrying through the trees why she had stayed. I walked back to the cabin and began the next section of notebooks. Vera Sutton's general store occupied the ground floor of a building on Main Street that had clearly been many things before it became a general store and had decided to retain evidence of all of them. The shelves were organized according to a system legible only to Vera herself. Canned goods beside ammunition, beside bolts of heavy fabric, beside the kind of hand tools I was learning to recognize from Eleanor's notebooks. A refrigerator case with local dairy products, and a rotating selection of things that Vera apparently felt the town needed whether or not it had asked for them. Vera herself was behind the counter when I came in, and she evaluated me with the directness of someone who had been evaluating strangers for 50 years and had no remaining patience for social softening. She was 76 years old, silver hair braided down her back to a length that suggested she had not cut it in a decade. Eyes that were sharp in the way that certain people's eyes are sharp when they have spent most of their lives actually paying attention to what is in front of them, rather than what they expect or hope to see. She looked at me without speaking for long enough that I had to resist the impulse to explain myself. "You look like Catherine," she said finally, around the eyes. The sound of my mother's name in this woman's mouth did something I had not anticipated. A physical response, involuntary, as though the name carried a frequency my body recognized before my mind did. Hearing it spoken by someone who had actually known her was a different order of experience than simply knowing she had existed. "You knew my mother," I said. "I knew Eleanor," Vera said. "For 50 years. She talked about your mother sometimes. About you after she found out you existed." I waited. Vera set down what she was holding and looked at me directly. "The pump in your cabin is broken. Did you know that I had known it since the second day? I had been boiling water from a pot I filled at the falls." "No," I said. "It is," she paused. "Delia Bridger can show you what to do, but you will need to do it yourself." It was not phrased as a suggestion. I found Delia Bridger at her father's ranch that afternoon in the equipment barn, doing something precise and complicated with a tractor component that she set aside without impatience when I appeared in the doorway. She was 31 years old, with her father's broad-shouldered practicality and a quality of direct attention that I would come to recognize as the particular characteristic of people who had grown up working with their hands, who had learned early that most problems yielded to steady effort applied in the right direction. She drove me back to the cabin and spent 90 minutes showing me the pump system without doing any of the actual work herself. She explained what each component did and why it failed and what the repair required, and then she handed me the tools and stepped back. It took me a day and a half. My hands were cut in 4 places by the time I was done, and I had disassembled and reassembled the pressure valve twice before I understood its logic. But when I turned the tap on the second afternoon and the water ran clear after 30 seconds rather than brown, I stood at the kitchen sink and felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not pride exactly. Something quieter and more durable than pride. The specific satisfaction of having figured out a thing that had been broken, of having made something work with your own hands when it had refused to work before. I went back to Vera's store the following morning and told her the pump was working. She nodded once as though this confirmed something she had suspected but needed to verify. "Come to Maze at 6, she said. "There are people who want to meet you." Walt Bridger was already in the back booth when I arrived, which was the booth farthest from the counter and the door, the booth where people sat when they wanted to have a conversation that was not performed for the room. He was 65 years old, and he looked like the Bitterroot Valley had made him personally, his face shaped by altitude and seasons, his hands resting on the table with the settled weight of hands that had been solving physical problems for 40 years. His family had worked the land 3 miles from Eleanor's property for 4 generations. He was, I would learn, the person Eleanor had trusted most completely in her final years. The one she had called when the pump failed the first time, when the roof needed work she could not do alone. He had driven out to her cabin every month for the last decade to check on things she would not ask to have checked. He looked at me across the table with the same evaluating directness as his daughter and said without preamble that Eleanor's land had saved his ranch in 2018. The drought that year had been the worst in 30 years in the valley. Wells that had been reliable for generations had gone dry. His cattle had begun to drop. The bank was 3 missed payments from foreclosure on land his great-grandfather had broken from wilderness with his own hands. He had gone to Eleanor not knowing what he expected to find, and she had spent 3 hours with him in the living grid, showing him where to dig, how to redirect water from the network without compromising its integrity, how to tap into a resource that had been sustaining this valley since long before either of them was born. 300 head of cattle, his family's legacy, 4 generations of broken ground and planted seed, and the particular stubbornness required to make a life in a place that did not make it easy. He had asked Eleanor what he owed her. She had said, "Pay it forward when the time comes." Walt looked at me across the table at May's Diner and said he figured the time had come. Delia arrived 20 minutes into the conversation, sliding into the booth beside her father with the ease of someone who had sat in this booth 1,000 times before. She told me about the first time she had met Eleanor at 16, cutting across the property on her way to a fishing spot she had been explicitly told not to use. Eleanor had appeared from the trees without any warning, caught Delia in the act with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been watching the approach from a distance, and had lectured her for 40 minutes about the difference between the rights that land ownership conferred and the responsibilities it required. Then she had handed Delia a pair of work gloves and put her to work clearing brush for the rest of the afternoon as restitution. "Best lesson I ever had," Delia said. She was not being sentimental. She meant it as a practical statement of fact. The lesson, as she described it, was not about property boundaries or trespassing. It was about shortcuts, about the difference between the route that saved 20 minutes and the route that taught you something about the land you were moving through. Eleanor had not been angry about the trespassing. She had been disappointed about the laziness, the willingness to skim across the surface of a place rather than engaging with it honestly. Do the work properly or do not do it at all. I listened to both of them talk about Eleanor and felt a specific grief that was different from the grief I associated with my mother, who I had lost before I could fully form the memory of losing. This was the grief of something I had never had, but had just belatedly understood that I had needed. A grandmother. A woman who had lived long enough to accumulate the kind of knowledge that does not arrive quickly, and who had apparently been willing to share it with anyone who showed up willing to work for it. I was not the only one who had noticed Garrett Spivey. He had arrived at Walt's ranch in November answering a help-wanted posting for seasonal labor that Walt did not clearly remember placing. He had worked hard enough in the first weeks to justify keeping on when the original job ended. He was 35, quiet in a way that Delia had described to me as watching rather than shyness, which was a distinction I understood immediately because I had made the same observation the first time I saw him at the counter of May's Diner. He asked questions, Delia said, not the questions of someone learning a new place, the questions of someone filling out a form. He had been present when Eleanor was brought up in conversation. He had been present now that I thought back at the diner when I had mentioned the notebooks to Delia. I had watched him shift on his stool at the counter and lean marginally closer, and I had noted it without following the note to its conclusion because I had been processing too many other things at once. That was a mistake I would not repeat. I returned to the cabin that night with a different quality of attention applied to everything around me. I checked the cabin before I entered. I looked at the tree line from the porch for longer than I needed to. I noticed for the first time the faint marks in the mud at the edge of the clearing that might have been animal tracks and might not have been. Then I went inside and read until I found the entry I had known since finishing. The 1984 notebooks was waiting for me somewhere in the later volumes. It was in a notebook from 2024 written in January, 4 months before Eleanor's cancer diagnosis. The handwriting had changed from the earliest volumes, slower and more deliberate, the letters larger, a concession to eyesight that had required more consideration. But the voice was unchanged, the same precision, the same refusal to ornament a fact with anything other than what it required. I believe they are watching again, she had written. Not actively, not with the aggression of the early years, something more patient, waiting for what they have always been waiting for me to become old enough that the property becomes vulnerable, for the moment when there is no one left who knows what is here and why it matters. I need to find her, she had written 2 weeks later. I need to find Catherine's daughter before I run out of time. If I can find her, if she will come, if she is willing to understand what she is being asked to carry, then perhaps this does not end when I do. I closed that notebook and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet that the waterfall creates when you have lived with it long enough to hear through it rather than only at it. I had not been chosen arbitrarily. I had not been chosen primarily for what I might inherit. I had been found after 20 years of searching because Eleanor Voss had understood that the living grid and the aquifer it protected would not survive her death unless she could find someone willing to stand where she had stood. She had found me because I was the closest thing to family she had. And she had left me 40 years of notebooks because she understood that the only way to ask someone to take on a responsibility of this magnitude was to first help them understand exactly what it meant. The man who stepped into the clearing on a Tuesday morning was 55 years old, silver-streaked hair combed with care, wearing hiking clothing that had been purchased to look appropriate for this setting, and succeeded only in demonstrating that he had not actually spent time in settings like this. His boots were clean, his jacket was new, his smile engaged every muscle in his face except the ones behind his eyes. I had been on my hands and knees beside one of the stone channels in the western clearing, following its path through a section of undergrowth, with the notebook I had bought in Ridge Creek open beside me, my jeans muddy to the knee, and my hands stained with the dark soil that seemed to cling to everything in this clearing, because it was dense with life and had no interest in letting go. I heard the footsteps before I turned, too deliberate for an animal, too confident for someone who was lost. "You must be Ms. Ashworth," he said. He said it as though he had been looking forward to this. I stood up. I did not brush the mud from my jeans. "Preston Caldwell," he said, "Regional Director of Development for Apex Water Corporation." He extended a hand. I did not take it. I have been hoping we would have the chance to meet. Every instinct I had developed over a childhood spent reading adults for signs of what they actually intended, sharpened by 5 years of identifying patterns in financial data, told me to remain very still and very watchful. He looked around the clearing with an expression that was meant to convey appreciation, but read as assessment. Tallying. The look of someone calculating what a thing is worth rather than responding to what it is. He reached into his jacket and produced a business card embossed with gold lettering. Apex Water Corporation was prepared to offer me $600,000 for the property. Cash. A clean transaction, no complications, more than enough to rebuild everything I had lost in Houston and create the stable, secure life that a young woman in my position might reasonably want. He said, young woman, in the particular way that some men use the phrase to remind you that they consider your age relevant to your judgment. No, I said. Something moved behind his eyes. The recalibration of a man encountering unexpected resistance and locating his next approach. Perhaps you would like time to consider, he said. Running a property of this size requires resources and experience that most people in your situation do not have access to. He paused, and when he spoke again, something had shifted at the edges of his pleasant tone. Someone with no local connections, no experience with what rural property ownership actually requires. The offer will not remain open indefinitely. No, I said again. This land is not for sale. He held the business card toward me a second time. Everything is for sale, Ms. Ashworth. It is simply a matter of finding the right circumstances. He walked back through the trees, and I stood watching the space where he had been for a long time after he disappeared. That night, I told Vera what had happened. She went pale in a way I had not seen on her before, and then went to the back room and returned with a manila folder thick enough to require a rubber band. She spread the contents across the kitchen table, and the three-generation history of what Apex Water Corporation had been doing to Eleanor Voss laid itself out in newsprint, in handwritten notes and legal correspondence going back to 1984. The grandfather, the son, now Preston Caldwell, who had grown up in a family that had been trying to take this land since before he was born. This has always been about the water, Vera said. They buy land with aquifer access, drill extraction wells, sell the rights to municipalities at margins that bear no relationship to what they paid. She set a hand flat on the table. Your land is the one they have never been able to get. What do? I asked. You do what Eleanor did, Vera said. Except this time you will not do it alone. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Eleanor did not have what you have. She made this community what it is. And now this community is yours. I drove back to the cabin in the early dark, the mountains invisible against a sky that still held the last blue of the evening. I sat on the porch for a long time before I went inside. 3 days after Caldwell's visit, I returned to the cabin from an afternoon spent mapping the grid with Delia to find the door standing 2 inches open. I always locked it. The habit was 28 years of apartments and foster homes, and the particular vigilance of someone who had learned that what you did not secure could be taken. I stood on the porch for a moment listening. The waterfall ran at its usual pitch. The clearing was still. Then I went in. The cabin had been searched with professional efficiency, not ransacked in the way of panic, but methodically turned, every drawer replaced at a slightly different angle, every shelf disturbed in ways that were only visible because I had spent weeks learning exactly how Eleanor had arranged things. The kitchen drawers were closed but not quite flush. The books on the shelves had been replaced in the wrong order. Small things, the kind of things that someone confident in their work and not expecting close examination would not bother to correct. The trap door in the floor stood open. I went down the ladder with my flashlight. The shelves where the 1984 and 1985 notebooks had been held only dust in the memory of their weight. 6 volumes gone. The ones that documented the original campaign of harassment with the detail and precision of a woman who had understood that documentation was the only weapon available to someone without power or money. On the floor, whether they had been a business card, gold lettering, Preston Caldwell, Apex Water Corporation. On the back, in a handwriting I did not recognize but understood immediately, written in the neat script of someone accustomed to leaving messages that arrived with force, $800,000. 72 hours. I sat on the floor of the underground room and looked at the empty shelves for a long time. Then I climbed back up the ladder. That same night, Garrett Spivey disappeared from Walt Bridger's ranch without a forwarding address, without taking anything that did not belong to him, vanishing as cleanly as someone who had been planning the exit since the day he arrived. The 10th night, I was at the cabin 4 days before Caldwell's deadline arrived. I woke at 2 in the morning to a darkness so complete it had weight. The power was out. Not the flickering that had become familiar. A complete and total absence of electricity. The refrigerator silent, the small light I had left on in the kitchen gone, the darkness outside the windows, absolute in the way that mountain darkness is absolute when there is no moon. I lay still for 30 seconds listening. No storm. The air outside was quiet. The waterfall ran at its usual pitch. There was no wind, no rain, no natural cause I could identify for the power to be out. I got up. I found the flashlight by touch, assembled myself in the layers required for the 30-degree air outside, and went out to find the breaker box. The breaker box was fine. The problem was 40 feet further at the point where the power line met the external connection box at the edge of the clearing. The connection had been cut. Not frayed, not failed. Cut cleanly in the way that a tool designed for the purpose cuts. I stood in the beam of my flashlight and looked at the clean end of the severed wire and thought about the entry in Eleanor's notebook from October 15th, 1984. The power line cut on a night with no storm. 41 years later, the same clearing, the same message. I worked for 3 hours in temperatures that dropped to 28 degrees by the time I finished. My hands stopped feeling the cold after the first hour, which was both a relief and a concern I could not afford to address until the work was done. I made 2 mistakes that I caught and corrected, once because my fingers were not responding accurately, and once because the light angle was wrong and I was working from memory rather than sight. When the power came back on and the kitchen light appeared in the cabin window, I stood in the clearing for a moment and looked at the tree line. Nothing moved. Nothing was visible. But I understood with the clear certainty of someone who had just read 40 years of documentation about exactly this kind of action that I was being watched. I went inside, I washed my hands, I sat down at the kitchen table, opened the notebook I had bought in Ridge Creek, and wrote the first entry in it. Night 10 at Whitewater Falls. The power line was cut tonight. No storm, just a message. The same message Eleanor received in October of 1984, 41 years ago in this same clearing. I repaired it myself. It took 3 hours and my hands are still cold. Eleanor wrote after her first experience of this that she understood now why some things were worth the difficulty of protecting. I think I am beginning to understand the same thing. She left me 40 years of preparation. It is my job now to use it. I closed the notebook. Then I went back to the shelves in the underground room and found the envelope. I had seen it before, had registered it without stopping. A plain white envelope tucked into the back cover of the final notebook, dated October of 2024, 6 weeks before Eleanor's death. My name was written on it in the careful, large handwriting of Eleanor's final months. The letters formed with deliberate effort, the pen pressing harder than necessary to make certain the impression was clear. Clara Ashworth. Not Ms. Ashworth, not to whom it may concern, not the legal language of the will and the transfer documents. Just my name, written by a woman who had been searching for me for 20 years and had run out of time to say what she needed to say in person. I carried the envelope up the ladder and set it on the kitchen table and sat across from it for several minutes before I opened it. 4 pages on paper that was already beginning to yellow at the edges, the ink still dark. Dear Clara, she had written, if you are reading this, then Raymond has found you, and I have run out of time to tell you these things face to face. I am sorry for that. I had hoped we might meet. I had imagined in the months since the diagnosis what it would be like to see Catherine's daughter in person, to see whether you have her eyes, her particular stubbornness, her habit of going very quiet when she was working something out that she was not yet ready to share. I had to stop and breathe before I continued. In January of 1996, she wrote, a young woman came to my door in the middle of the night. She was 22 years old, 7 months pregnant. Her left eye was swollen, nearly shut, and she moved the way people move when their ribs have been broken more than once and not fully healed between injuries. She had heard through the specific underground network that exists among women who know what it means to need help and to find it in the last possible place, that there was a woman who lived alone by the falls, that she helped people when no one else would, that she did not ask questions you were not ready to answer. Her name was Catherine Ashworth. She was from Austin. She was running from a man who had hurt her twice and would hurt her again if she gave him the opportunity. She had nowhere else to go. I took her in, Eleanor had written. I gave her the bedroom and slept on the couch. I drove to Missoula for the things she needed without telling her what I was doing or why. I simply did it because it needed doing, and I was there and she was not safe anywhere else. We became friends, then something closer than friends. Sisters, I think, in the way that two people who have no sisters can become sisters to each other when they stop performing and start simply being. She was bright and curious and funny in the dry, understated way of someone who has learned not to make too much noise, but cannot entirely suppress the intelligence that wants to make itself known. She asked questions about the grid, about the geology of the valley, about the aquifer. She had good instincts, and she asked good questions. She said she wanted to bring her children here someday. Plural, Eleanor had written. She used the word children even then, as though she already knew there would be more than one. The baby came on the 14th of March, Eleanor had written. He came 6 weeks early in the cabin because the roads were bad, and the nearest hospital was an hour and a half away, and there was no time. I had some training from my years teaching. I had done what I could to prepare, but I was a biology teacher and not a midwife, and the boy was very small and his lungs were not ready. He lived for 6 hours. I set the letter down. Then I picked it up again and kept reading because the only thing worse than knowing was stopping before I knew all of it. Eleanor had held him for all 6 of those hours, taking her turn in the careful rotation she and Catherine had established, without discussing it, the instinctive cooperation of two people who understood that what was happening required all of them. He had been held constantly, she wrote. He had not been put down once. Catherine had named him Noah. They had buried him beneath the oak tree at the edge of the clearing on the western side, in a grave marked with a stone that Eleanor had carried from the creek bed. She had not carved his name on it. The carving had seemed at that time too permanent a form of grief for something still too raw to be made permanent. She had intended to add it later. She had never been able to. Catherine had left in April when the roads were clear. She had left carrying a grief that Eleanor could not heal and a resilience that Eleanor had recognized as the particular kind that comes not from the absence of damage, but from the decision to keep going in spite of it. In 1997, Eleanor had written, I received a letter from Catherine. She had met someone in Austin. A good man, she wrote, and she used the phrase with the weight of someone who understood what the opposite of a good man looked like. She was pregnant. She was happy in the careful, provisional way of someone who has learned that happiness is not permanent, but has decided to accept it while it is present. She named the baby Clara. She wrote that the name meant clear light, the kind that comes after a long darkness. She said she hoped someday to bring you here. She never came. Eleanor had learned of Catherine's death in the spring of 2001 through a woman in Missoula who had seen a notice in an Austin paper. A highway accident. A Tuesday in March. Clara was 4 years old, and the world that had held her closed overnight like a fist, and she had tried to find me. For more than 20 years, she had tried through channels that ran against the particular closed architecture of the foster care system, which guards its records with the institutional stubbornness of an organization that has been burned before by people who did not have good intentions. She had no legal standing. She had only the knowledge that Catherine's daughter was somewhere in the system and the refusal to stop looking. Until March of 2024, when the doctors told her she had months, not years, and she hired the investigator who found my name in a professional licensing database 8 months later, 2 weeks before she died. You were never forgotten, she had written. Not for a single day. Your mother loved you with the particular ferocity of someone who had already lost one child and understood exactly what it meant to love something you could not guarantee keeping. She named you after the light that follows darkness. She told me you had her eyes and her stubbornness. I have loved you from a distance for 28 years, Clara. I have loved the idea of you, and now writing this, I am trying to love you in the actual particular person you have become, though I do not know who that person is and have run out of time to find out. The cabin is yours. The land is yours. The grid needs a protector who will still be standing when I am not. But more than any of that, I wanted you to know that you were always held. From the first moment Catherine told me about you, you were held in thought and in intention, and in the specific love that two women who had become sisters could offer the child one of them carried and the other of them could not. You were never abandoned. You were never forgotten. You were loved from a distance and through the years by people who could not find you but never stopped looking. With all of my heart, Eleanor. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it carefully along its original creases and set it on the table. Then I walked outside into the cold spring night. The oak tree stood at the edge of the clearing exactly where Eleanor had described it, and the stone at its base was there too small and weathered by nearly 30 years of mountain winters, sitting in the grass in a place where the roots made a kind of natural cradle. No carving, just a stone carried from the creek bed by a woman who had run out of grief strong enough to make the inscription feel possible. My brother had lived for 6 hours in this clearing. He had been held every one of those 6 hours. He had been named by a mother who had loved him before he was born and would love him beyond every definition of the word. He was buried here in the ground I had been walking on since I arrived. I stood at the oak tree rather than sitting. There was nothing left in me that required stillness. I had come here carrying so much that needed to be set down, and somewhere between reading the letter and walking across the clearing, most of it had found the ground. What remained was not grief exactly, or not only grief. It was something clearer, something that had more to do with understanding than with loss. I placed one hand on the bark of the tree above the stone. The cold of it traveled up through my palm and into my arm and settled somewhere in my chest, not uncomfortable, just present, just honest about what temperature the world maintained when no one was asking it to be otherwise. I stood there until the stars had wheeled their slow arc overhead and the sky above the peaks had begun its first faint suggestion of change. And then I said one thing into the dark before I walked back. I found you. I went back to the cabin. I made coffee on the wood stove. I drank it at the kitchen table beside Eleanor's letter and the closed notebooks. Then I picked up my phone and walked to the one spot in the clearing where the signal was sufficient, and I made 3 calls. The first call was to Vera Sutton. I told her about the power line, the ransacked cabin, the business card on the floor of the underground room, and the handwritten ultimatum on its back. The notebooks gone from the shelves, the specific ones, the 1984 and 1985 volumes that documented the original campaign with the detail and precision of a woman who had understood that documentation was the only weapon available to someone without power or money. Vera was quiet for long enough that I thought the signal had dropped. Then she said, I was waiting for this call. I have been waiting for this call for 30 years. She told me to come to town. The second call was to Walt Bridger. I told him I needed everyone who mattered at the cabin the following morning. He asked no questions. He said he would make the calls. The third call took longer to make. I stood in the clearing with the phone in my hand for several minutes before I dialed, looking at the tree line, at the mountains above it, at the waterfall, catching the early light in the way it caught light every morning, regardless of what was happening in the clearing beneath it. Nora Prentice answered on the third ring. I had found her name in Eleanor's address book, a small spiral-bound book with a worn cover and entries written in different inks across different decades. Nora Prentice had a note beside her name in Eleanor's handwriting. 2 words. She understands. Nora Prentice was an investigative reporter at the NBC affiliate in Missoula. She had been covering water rights issues in Montana for 11 years. She had written, I would later learn, the piece in 2019 that had prompted the state legislature to close a loophole in the aquifer extraction, permitting process, a loophole that Apex Water Corporation had been using to accelerate acquisition of drilling rights in 3 counties. The legislature had closed the loophole. Apex had adapted and continued. I told her I had 40 years of documented evidence of criminal harassment orchestrated by a single family-owned corporation. I told her the evidence included recorded phone calls, photographs, signed contracts executed under documented duress, and a paper trail connecting 3 generations of the Caldwell family to crimes that range from property destruction to witness intimidation to bribery of local officials. I told her I had been given 72 hours to sell my land or face the consequences of refusing. She asked one question. Are you willing to go on the record publicly knowing that they will try to destroy your credibility? Knowing they will dig into your history, your finances, your professional record, and use everything they find. I thought about the cardboard box I had carried out of Morrison and Grant 6 weeks ago. I thought about the 15 minutes I had been given to dismantle 5 years of identity. I thought about the $612 and the lease running out and the job listings I had scrolled through on a laptop balanced on accounting textbooks. I had already lost everything once I told her. I know exactly what I have left after that, and it is enough. She said, "Tell me what you need from me." Vera met me at her back door and brought me into the room she called her office, which was the storage room behind the main floor, packed with the accumulated records of 50 years of running the only general store in a 40-mile radius. Filing cabinets that had not been designed for the volume of paper they contained. Shelves of binders organized by year. A desk barely visible beneath its surface of correspondence and catalogs. She pulled a box from the bottom shelf of the largest filing cabinet. A banker's box sealed with tape that had dried and cracked with age. And when she opened it, I understood immediately what I was looking at. Eleanor had made copies. Not photocopies. She had transcribed. By hand in notebooks identical to the ones in the underground room, she had reproduced the key entries of the most important journals. The entries documenting threats. The entries recording the names of the men who had delivered those threats. The entries describing damage to her property with the clinical precision of a scientist cataloging evidence. Vera had been doing this with her for years. Trading notebooks, cross-checking transcriptions, building a redundant archive in a location that no one would think to search. She knew they might try to take the originals, Vera said. She always knew. She planned for every contingency she could imagine, and then planned for the ones she had not imagined yet. That was who Eleanor was. There is something else, Vera said, something she told me the week before she died, something even I did not know about until then. She described the safety deposit box. Eleanor had established it in 1990 after the second major wave of legal pressure from Apex, when she had understood that the fight was not going to resolve itself in years, but in decades, and that the evidence she was accumulating needed to exist in a form that would survive anything that might happen to her or to the cabin. She had registered it at First National Bank in Missoula under a name that had no connection to Eleanor Voss in any database. Margaret Holloway. An identity she had created for precisely this purpose paper, and nothing more existing solely to protect what she was putting in the box. The passphrase she had set for access was not a number and not a word from her own history. It was the name of the child buried under the oak tree at the edge of the clearing. The name that appeared on no birth certificate, no death certificate, no legal document of any kind. The name that existed only in the memory of three people, Eleanor and Catherine and Vera, two of whom were gone. Eleanor had told Vera the week before she died. She had also said that if the right person came, she would know what the passphrase was, that the right person would have been given everything they needed to find it. I had read the letter twice. I had memorized it the way you memorize things that rearrange the fundamental coordinates of your understanding of yourself. "Noah," I said. Vera closed her eyes for a moment. "Yes," she said. Noah. Delia drove me to Missoula the following morning before the banks opened. We left at 5:30 in the dark, the truck headlights picking out the road ahead, in a way that made the rest of the world feel very far away. The mountains on either side reduced to black shapes against a sky that was beginning to suggest rather than display the approach of dawn. We did not talk much on the drive. Delia was not a person who filled silence with words when silence served better, which was one of the things I had come to appreciate about her. She drove and I watched the landscape change from mountain valley to foothills to the wider plain that held Missoula, and I thought about Eleanor making the same drive at intervals across 40 years, carrying her evidence to a bank and placing it in the keeping of a system she trusted more than she trusted the people who had been trying to take her land. First National Bank opened at 9. We were waiting outside at 8:55. The branch manager was a man in his 40s with the careful professional manner of someone who handled unusual requests by treating them as routine. I told him I needed to access a safety deposit box registered under the name Margaret Holloway. He explained the passphrase protocol. He led me to the vault. The box was larger than I expected, 12 inches by 18 8 inches deep. I carried it to the private viewing room and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment before I opened it. Inside was 40 years of patience. The first layer was physical documentation. Contracts that Eleanor had been pressured to sign in the early years, agreements that would have given Mercer Resources survey access to her property, each accompanied by a separate handwritten narrative describing the circumstances of their execution. Her notes were specific, dated, and precise. She had written down the names of everyone present. She had described the specific language used to pressure her. She had noted in several cases the names of witnesses. Beneath the contracts were the recordings. Eleanor had begun recording her conversations with Mercer Resources representatives in October of 1984, using equipment she had mail-ordered from a catalog after the first threat, working within the one-party consent laws of Montana. The original cassette tapes had been transferred to compact discs in the 1990s, and the compact discs had been converted to digital files on a small external drive in the 2000s. The drive was in a sealed plastic case with a label in Eleanor's handwriting listing the file names and dates. I picked up the drive and held it. 40 years of evidence, recorded threats, named individuals, dates that could be cross-referenced with corporate records. A complete documentary history of what 3 generations of one family had been willing to do to acquire a piece of land they had no right to. Beneath the drive was a manila envelope containing photographs, property damage dated and labeled in Eleanor's hand. The burned barn in 1985 photographed from multiple angles in the days after the fire, showing details that the official fire marshal's report had not included. Subsequent incidents documented with the same methodical care. And at the bottom of the box, a handwritten list. Names, dates, amounts. A record of payments made to local officials across 3 decades compiled from sources Eleanor had spent years developing and cross-referencing. Not speculation, not inference. Documentation assembled by a woman who had understood that the only way to fight a campaign like this one was to be more patient, more thorough, and more disciplined than the people conducting it. I sat in the viewing room for 20 minutes, going through the contents systematically, the way I had been trained to go through financial records. Then I packed everything carefully back into the box, signed the transfer documentation, and carried Eleanor's 40 years of preparation out into the Missoula morning. Delia was waiting on a bench outside. She looked at my face when I came through the door and asked no questions. She simply stood up and held the door to the truck open, and we drove back to Ridge Creek with the box between us. The next 36 hours had the quality of deep focus that I associated with the most demanding periods of my accounting work, the periods when everything else fell away, and there was only the task and the information and the sequence of actions required to complete it correctly. Nora Prentice drove up from Missoula that afternoon and sat at Eleanor's kitchen table for 3 hours going through the contents of the box with the concentrated attention of a journalist who understood that what she was looking at was going to require her best work. She asked precise questions. She took careful notes. She identified which elements of the documentation were independently verifiable and what additional evidence she would need to build a story that could not be legally challenged. She had been covering Apex Water Corporation for 11 years. She already had pieces of the picture that Eleanor had not been able to see from her position in the Valley corporate filings and regulatory records, and the accounts of other landowners who had experienced versions of the same campaign without 40 years of preparation to resist it. What Eleanor had preserved in the safety deposit box was the connective tissue that joined those pieces into a complete and irrefutable pattern. "This is enough," Nora said near the end of the 3rd hour. "This is more than enough." Then she said, "When does the 72 hours expire?" "Friday morning," I told her. 9 o'clock based on when Caldwell had appeared in the clearing on Tuesday. She looked at me across the table. "I want to be there," she said, "with a camera crew. I know how to do a live broadcast from a remote location. We do it for wildfire coverage. But this only works if you are willing to let it happen exactly as it happens. If Caldwell comes and you have the conversation in front of a live audience, there is no editing, no second chance, no taking back anything that is said. I thought about Eleanor standing in this clearing alone for 40 years. I thought about the business card on the floor of the underground room. I thought about a power line cut on a cold night as a message, the same message delivered in the same place 41 years apart, as though time itself meant nothing to the people sending it. Do the broadcast, I said. Sheriff Harlan Foss had the kind of face that belonged to a man who had spent 30 years dealing with the gap between what the law permitted him to do and what justice actually required. He was 58 years old, had been the county sheriff for 12 of those years, and had been building a file on Apex Water Corporation for 7 of them. He had enough for inconvenience. He had not had enough for action until now. I sat across from him in his office on Wednesday afternoon with the digital files from Eleanor's safety deposit box transferred to a thumb drive and the complete documentation of the bribery payments on the table between us, and watched his expression move through several distinct phases as he went through what I had brought him. When he was finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. I have been waiting for something like this, he said. Not quite like this, but something. He picked up his phone and called the FBI field office in Helena. I sat across from him and listened to him describe what he was looking at in the patient, precise language of law enforcement, and I thought about Eleanor in this same valley probably having sat in the same building at some point across 40 years, and whether anyone had ever said those words to her. I have been waiting for something like this. By Wednesday evening, Walt Bridger had organized 7 families, ranchers and farmers whose land bordered the valley, whose wells drew from the same underground reserve, whose children and grandchildren would inherit whatever we managed or failed to protect now. They established a watch rotation in shifts pairs of people stationed at intervals along the access road and the property boundaries, communicating by radio, in the way that people who have worked land together for generations communicate efficiently and without drama. Walt himself would be at the cabin before dawn on Friday. Delia spent Thursday installing cameras. 6 of them small and weatherproofed, powered by solar panels. She had assembled herself mounted in the trees around the clearing at heights and angles that would capture every part of the open space in front of the cabin. She disguised the housings with bark and lichen and the particular patience of someone who had learned from her father that the most effective preparation was the kind that left no evidence of itself. "They are looking for a woman alone," she said, standing in the clearing in the late afternoon light, looking at the trees where the cameras were invisible. "They keep making that mistake. They made it with Eleanor, and now they are making it with you." She looked at me. "Let them," she said. I spent Thursday evening alone in the cabin. I cooked a proper meal on the wood stove I had learned to use properly because it seemed important on this particular evening to do the things that belonged to this place, the things Eleanor had done in this kitchen for 40 years. I ate at the kitchen table with her letter beside me and the notebook stacked along the wall and the trapdoor closed and latched in the floor of the main room. After dinner, I went out to the oak tree. The air was cold and clear in the way of Montana spring nights, the kind of cold that has teeth but does not mean harm, just honestly reports the temperature of a world that maintains its own standards regardless of what the people in it prefer. The stars above the clearing were the kind that require genuine darkness to fully reveal themselves, and in this valley 12 miles from the nearest town, the darkness was genuine. I stood at the tree, not sitting, not processing, not mourning, because I had done all of that already, and what remained on this particular night was different. I rested one hand on the bark above the stone and felt the cold of the wood travel up through my palm. I told Noah what was going to happen in the morning. I told him about Eleanor and what she had spent 40 years building. I told him about Vera and Walt and Delia and the 7 families on the access road. I told him about Nora Prentice and the camera crew and Sheriff Foss and the FBI agents driving from Helena. I told him that tomorrow this was going to end. Then I said the same thing I had said 2 nights before when I first stood here after reading Eleanor's letter. Just 2 words into the dark above the stone, quiet enough that only the tree could hear. "We're ready." I went back to the cabin, lay down on the narrow bed, and slept without difficulty for the first time since arriving at Whitewater Falls. The morning of the 72nd hour came in gray and cold with a thin cloud cover that diffused the light evenly across the clearing, The kind of light that flattens shadows and makes everything equally visible. Good light for a broadcast. Eleanor would have appreciated the irony. I was dressed and on the porch before 6. Walt arrived at 6:15 in his pickup, said nothing beyond a nod, and took up a position at the edge of the tree line where he could see the access road. Delia was already in the trees on the other side confirming camera feeds on her phone. Nora Prentice had arrived before 4 with a two-person crew and equipment they had spent 3 hours setting up and concealing along the tree line. Sheriff Foss had called me at 10 the previous night. The FBI agent from Helena had reviewed the documentation and authorized a field response. 2 agents would be in Ridge Creek by 8. The state police had been briefed. By 7:30, the clearing held more people than it appeared to. I stood on the porch and drank coffee and watched the access road. At 8:55, I heard the engines. They came up the road with the sound of vehicles that have been maintained to perform rather than merely function. 2 black SUVs and a third vehicle behind them, moving in the careful convoy of people who have rehearsed their entrance. Preston Caldwell stepped out of the lead vehicle at 9 o'clock exactly. He was a man who valued precision in small things, as though precision was a form of authority. He was dressed with the same careful calibration as before, expensive clothing deployed to suggest rural competence it did not actually represent. His silver-streaked hair was combed. His expression was the expression of a man who believed he was arriving to conclude something. 3 lawyers got out of the second vehicle. 2 men in the third who were not lawyers. Caldwell looked at the cabin, looked at me on the porch, looked at the clearing with the assessing eye of someone who had been thinking about this space as an asset rather than a place for long enough that he could no longer see it any other way. He walked across the clearing toward the porch steps. "Ms. Ashworth." His voice was pleasant and unhurried, calibrated to project confidence without aggression. The tone of a man who believed the outcome was already determined and was simply going through the motions required to formalize it. "I hope you have had time to think carefully about your situation." "I have," I said. He reached the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at me. I remained on the porch. I did not descend to meet him on level ground. I let him stand at the bottom of the steps and look up. "And your decision," he said. "My decision is the same as it was on Tuesday," I said. "The same as it was every time you asked Eleanor Voss. The same as it has been for 40 years in this clearing." "No." His pleasant expression did not change on the surface, but something behind it shifted the adjustment of a man moving from one prepared response to the next. "I think you may not fully appreciate your circumstances," he said. He gestured toward the lawyers behind him. "We have legal resources that can make your ownership of this property extraordinarily difficult to maintain. We can raise questions about the validity of the transfer. We can initiate proceedings that will occupy your time and finances for years." He paused. "You have no income that I am aware of, no family to support you, no experience with the kind of sustained legal and financial pressure we are prepared to bring." He let that sit for a moment. "Take the money, Ms. Ashworth. $800,000. Walk away from a fight you cannot win. Start the life you actually want somewhere that makes sense for a person in your situation." I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone. I turned the screen toward him. The screen showed a live broadcast interface active and running. The viewer count in the corner read 4,300 and climbing. Nora Prentice's station logo was visible in the upper corner. Caldwell's eyes went to the screen. Then his eyes went to the trees. He was looking for the cameras. He could not find them because Delia had done her job. "You have been broadcasting for 6 minutes," I said. "Everything you just said about legal pressure and financial resources and my circumstances. 4,000 people heard it. The number is going up." The color left his face in a way that was not dramatic, but was thorough, a steady draining of the certainty that had sustained his expression since he stepped out of the SUV. His lawyers were already on their phones. I stepped down from the porch. I walked across the clearing until I was close enough to see the individual details of his face, the particular way a man's expression rearranges itself when the certainty he has been operating on proves to have been false. The sweat at his temple despite the cold morning air. The pulse visible in his throat, the eyes moving quickly, calculating, looking for the exit that was not there. "Your family has been doing this for 40 years, I said. My voice was steady. I had practiced no particular words. What came out was simply what was true. Your grandfather came to this clearing in 1984 and told a woman to take his money and leave before something happened she would regret. His people cut her power line. They burned her barn. They stood in the tree line and watched it burn to make sure she understood who had done it." Caldwell said nothing. Behind him, his lawyers were speaking quietly into phones with the rapid, focused diction of people managing an emergency. "Your father continued it through the 90s, I said. Legal campaigns designed to exhaust her financially and emotionally, designed to wear down a woman who had no family and no institutional support, and nothing but her own stubbornness standing between your family and what you wanted." He took a breath to speak. I continued. "And you," I said, "you watched Eleanor Voss get old and sick, and you decided the time had finally come. You sent a man to work on Walt Bridger's ranch to watch her, to watch me. You broke into this cabin and stole 40 years of her documentation because you thought that was all the evidence that existed." His jaw tightened. "You were wrong about that," I said. "You were wrong about the evidence, and you were wrong about what you were fighting. You thought you were fighting one woman. You thought that was what Eleanor was. One woman alone in a cabin. Isolated. Vulnerable. Someone who could eventually be outlasted or broken or bought." The sound of engines came from the access road, not the sound of the vehicles that had arrived at 9 o'clock. A different sound. More vehicles. Slower. The sound of people who were not in a hurry because they did not need to be. Sheriff Harlan Foss's vehicle came around the last curve first. He stepped out with the unhurried ease of a man who had been doing this for 30 years and understood that the moment required presence rather than speed. Behind his vehicle were 2 state police cruisers. Behind those, a plain sedan with federal plates. And behind all of them, Walt Bridger's pickup. And behind Walt's pickup, 6 more vehicles that I recognize. The Hennessy ranch truck, the family across the eastern boundary who ran cattle and whose great-grandmother had shaken Eleanor's hand when she arrived in 1982. The Orr siblings who had inherited their parents' place and kept it running together through 3 difficult decades. Families whose names I had learned from Eleanor's notebooks before I learned them from the people themselves. Families whose land and water and futures were connected to this clearing and the aquifer beneath it in ways that Preston Caldwell had never understood because he had never tried to. 23 people got out of those vehicles and stood in the morning light at the edge of the clearing. Not aggressive, not loud, simply present. The particular presence of people who have decided that something requires their physical attendance and have shown up to provide it. "You were wrong about what you were fighting," I said to Caldwell quietly enough that only he could hear. Eleanor wasn't alone. She was never alone. She built something here. Not just the grid, not just the documentation. She built this. These people, this community. And when she couldn't find me for 20 years, they were here. They were always here. Harlan Foss walked across the clearing at his own pace. "Preston Caldwell," he said without particular inflection. "I have a few questions about some property reported stolen from this cabin several days ago, and about some documents indicating that your company has been engaged in criminal conduct toward landowners in this county for approximately 4 decades." He stopped a few feet away. "I would appreciate it if you would come with me." Caldwell's lawyer stepped forward. Foss acknowledged them with a patience that suggested he had been expecting them. The FBI agents came forward from the sedan with federal plates. I stepped back. I watched Preston Caldwell's expression complete its journey from certainty to calculation to something that was not quite defeat, but was its immediate predecessor. The moment when a man who has operated for decades on the assumption that resources and patience were sufficient to overcome any obstacle encounters an obstacle that turns out to be a different category of thing entirely. He was looking at the viewer count on the broadcast screen when the handcuffs went on. It was north of 12,000 by then. The investigation took 3 months. Nora Prentice's reporting built on what Eleanor had preserved and extended outward into the corporate history of Apex Water Corporation, in ways that required the kind of access and sourcing that 11 years of investigative work had provided. She found the other landowners, 4 counties, 40 years, a consistent pattern of acquisition tactics that range from aggressive negotiation to criminal coercion, with a particularly clear documentation trail in Ridge Creek County, thanks to one woman who had understood that evidence outlasted everything else. Garrett Spivey cooperated with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced charge. His testimony confirmed the surveillance operation, the instructions he had received from Apex's regional director, the break-in at the cabin, and the theft of the original notebooks, which were recovered from a storage facility outside Missoula and returned to the underground room where Eleanor had placed them. Preston Caldwell was charged with breaking and entering, theft, harassment, criminal intimidation, and federal wire fraud charges stemming from the interstate nature of the coercion campaign. 2 senior executives at Apex's corporate headquarters were charged alongside him when the subpoenaed corporate records revealed the extent of their involvement in authorizing the decades-long campaign. The company's stock lost 43% of its value in the week following Nora's broadcast. Environmental organizations filed civil suits in 3 states. Shareholders demanded accountability from a board that had none to offer. By November, Apex Water Corporation had filed for voluntary bankruptcy. The water rights portfolio was liquidated in a court-supervised auction. A conservation trust backed by federal environmental funding acquired the majority of the holdings, including the survey rights that 3 generations of the Caldwell family had spent 40 years trying to establish over the land at Whitewater Falls. The living grid and the aquifer it protected were designated permanently protected under the Montana Water Heritage Act. What Eleanor had protected through the force of her own will and presence for 4 decades was now protected by something that did not age or tire or die. I barely noticed most of this as it happened. I was too busy learning how to live. The cabin transformed around me through the summer and into the fall in the way that things transform when people who know what they are doing show up and apply that knowledge. Walt and his sons replaced sections of the roof that had been allowing moisture in since Eleanor's final winter. The foundation was reinforced where the spring thaw had been working at the edges for years. New windows properly sealed that still caught the morning light the way the old ones had, but held the warmth in a way the old ones had not. Delia worked on the porch, which she rebuilt from the substructure upward using lumber. She selected herself in methods she had learned from her father, who had learned them from his, the particular knowledge of how to build for Montana winters that is passed down rather than learned from manuals. The new porch was indistinguishable from the old one in character and completely different in integrity. It would stand for 40 years without apology. I learned things that summer that no accounting curriculum had equipped me for. Walt taught me to read the land the way Eleanor had described, learning to read it through seasons rather than through single observations, through the patterns that only became visible when you had been watching long enough to understand what the variation meant. He showed me how to tell when the water table was rising by looking at the plants that grew near the base of the falls. How to know when a storm was building 3 hours before the clouds arrived by the way the air tasted at the eastern edge of the property. How to move through the grid without compressing the soil over the channels in ways that would redirect water along unintended paths. He taught me all of this the way he taught most things, by doing it beside me and letting me make the mistakes that were instructive and intervening only at the mistakes that would cause damage. He called me his second daughter for the first time in August in passing, as though the title had always existed, and he was simply acknowledging it rather than conferring it. I did not correct him. Delia became the thing I had not known I needed. Something more specific than a sister and more durable than a friend. Someone who showed up without announcement and stayed without overstaying and left without drama and came back. Someone who did not require explanations for the days when the weight of everything I had learned in this clearing made conversation feel like more than I could manage. She built her own cabin in September, a mile up the valley on land she had been saving to build on since she was 23. She did most of the work herself over 6 weeks, and I spent enough time working alongside her to understand the specific satisfaction she took in the process. The same satisfaction I had felt fixing the pump in my first week here. The knowledge that the thing in front of you is standing because you put it there with your own hands. The old barn became a classroom on Saturday mornings. The idea had come to me in August while sitting in the clearing going through Eleanor's later notebooks. She had written in a 2008 entry that the most important failure of her work was that it remained hers. That knowledge held by one person dies with that person. That the grid had survived for centuries because it had been held by a community passed down through generations as something essential, not preserved by one person's vigilance alone. I had set the notebook down and looked at the barn. The first Saturday, 6 children came. Their parents stood in the doorway watching. By the third Saturday, the parents were inside. By the fifth, the barn was full, and I had borrowed 4 additional folding chairs from Vera's storeroom and was drawing diagrams on a chalkboard that Delia had installed on the wall facing the door. I was not a natural teacher. The first lessons were halting and full of pauses while I worked out how to explain things I had learned through direct physical contact with the soil and stone rather than through language. But the children were patient with me, and I learned from their questions, which were better than my explanations. And gradually the Saturday mornings became something that people in Ridge Creek organized their weekend around. The women began arriving in September. The first one came on a Wednesday afternoon, a young mother with 2 children, and bruises she wore with the particular self-consciousness of someone who has learned that the bruises themselves are a form of evidence against her in some calculi. She had heard about the cabin from a shelter in Missoula. She had heard that someone there might help without asking more than you were ready to answer. I gave her the bedroom. I slept on the couch. I fed her children and let them explore the clearing and did not ask about the bruises or the man or the circumstances, except when she chose to tell me, which she did gradually over the 3 weeks she stayed. She left for her sister's place in Oregon on a Tuesday morning with a notebook full of resource contacts and the knowledge that she had stood beside a waterfall in Montana for 3 weeks and not been afraid of what was coming next. The second woman arrived 2 weeks later, then a third. Then words stopped being something that traveled and became something that was simply known through the networks that exist between women who understand what it means to need a place that does not ask the wrong questions. I did what Eleanor had done. I did what my mother had needed when there was no one else to provide it. I opened the door. On the evening before the official heritage designation ceremony, Vera asked me to walk with her. We followed the path to the western clearing in the early dark, Vera moving with the care of her age on the uneven ground and refusing the arm I offered. The moon was full enough to light the path. The waterfall was the sound of everything familiar by then, the sound that had become the baseline of my life in this valley. We stopped at the oak tree. Vera stood beside the unmarked stone for a long time without speaking. She told me things Eleanor had not included in the letter. Small things, specifics, the texture of the 6 weeks Catherine had spent in this cabin in the winter of 1996. How she had laughed at breakfast, what she had been reading, the particular way she had talked about the future with the careful optimism of someone who was learning slowly to believe that she was allowed to have one. She told me how Eleanor had been after Catherine left. Not broken because Eleanor was not a person who broke, but changed. Quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the isolation she had chosen and everything to do with something that had been opened and then closed too quickly. She told me how Eleanor had talked about me. In the years after she learned I existed the way she had imagined me growing up somewhere, becoming someone the hope she had held that Catherine's stubbornness had survived in me and was serving me somewhere in a life Eleanor could not see. She found me, I said. She never stopped looking, Vera said. I set my hand on the stone at the base of the oak tree. The granite was cold from the night air, solid and specific under my fingers. 30 years of mountain winters had smoothed it without erasing it. It was still exactly what Eleanor had intended it to be when she carried it from the creek bed. A marker, a presence, a refusal to let something go unnamed even when the naming was too painful to carve into stone. The first light found the peaks before it found the clearing the next morning. The mountains came back to themselves slowly the way certain truths do, emerging from darkness, not all at once but incrementally, detail by detail, until the whole was restored. I had been standing beside the stone long enough that the cold had stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like the temperature of the place itself, which was simply what it was. The ceremony was in the morning with the official designation, the reporters from Missoula and Helena and Denver, the cameras that would record the moment when what Eleanor had protected became permanently protected beyond the reach of any future Caldwell, in any future black vehicle, on any future Tuesday morning. But this was the moment that mattered. This clearing, this tree, this stone with no name carved on it yet. This woman standing beside me who had kept faith with something for 50 years. In the morning I gave the speech. I stood in the clearing with the waterfall behind me and the mountains above, and the faces of the people who had become my family in the months since I had arrived with $612 and 3 rusted keys and no idea what I had come to find. I talked about Eleanor. I talked about what 40 years of standing alone in one place meant when the thing you were standing for was larger than yourself. I talked about the grid, about what it represented, about the knowledge it embodied, and what it required of us to be worthy of it. Then I stopped talking about Eleanor and talked about all of them. About Walt, who had shown up every month for a decade to check on an old woman who would not ask for help and who had paid forward a debt that was never his to begin with because he had understood that some debts belong to everyone. About Delia, who had handed me a wrench and stepped back and given me the particular gift of letting me find out what I was capable of. About Vera, who had kept faith with Eleanor's secrets for 50 years and had known when she looked at my face in her store doorway that the waiting was over. About the 7 families on the access road who had stood in the morning light and said without words that they understood what was at stake and had chosen to be here. I said that the land did not belong to me. It had never belonged to one person. That was the point. That was what the living grid was at its most fundamental level. Not a monument to the intelligence of its builders, though it was that. Not simply a water management system, though it was that too. It was evidence that a community of people who had understood their dependence on a specific place had built something designed to last beyond the lifetimes of any individual among them, designed to be maintained collectively, to be passed down collectively, to be understood as belonging to everyone who depended on it. Eleanor had protected it alone because she had had no choice, but she had always known that alone was not the right answer. It was the only available answer for 40 years. Now it was not the only available answer anymore. The designation was signed. The cameras recorded it. The reporters wrote their pieces. The people of Ridge Creek stood in the clearing that had been the site of a quiet war for 4 decades and felt, I think, what I felt standing among them. That something had been finished, and something else was beginning. 1 year later, on a morning in early spring, I carried my 3rd notebook to the edge of the waterfall and sat on the rock that had become my habitual sitting place, the flat shelf that caught the morning sun and remained dry even when the mist from the falls was heaviest. I opened the notebook to the first empty page. The mountains were doing what they always did, which was exist with the complete indifference to human timescale that is the most honest thing about mountains. The waterfall was doing what it always did. The clearing behind me held the cabin Walt's sons had helped me fortify against the winters ahead, the barn where 30 people crowded in on Saturday mornings, the oak tree, at the western edge where 3 young maples now stood alongside the stone I had replaced in September. The new stone was granite from the creek bed shaped by a craftsman in Missoula who had done the work without charging for it after reading Nora Prentice's original story. The carving was clean and permanent. Noah James Ashworth, March 14th, 1996. Love for 6 hours and every hour since. I visited him every evening. I sat beside the stone and talked about the day, the women who had come and gone, the children in the Saturday class, the progress of the spring planting and the sections of the grid we were working to restore. I told him about Vera, whose health had been requiring more consideration lately, who still came every Sunday with food I did not need, and stories I could not get enough of. About Walt, who had begun teaching his grandson the same things he had taught me, in the same way by working beside him and letting the mistakes that were instructive happen. About Delia, who had started a second classroom in her own barn for adults who wanted to learn the construction methods of the valley, the specific techniques for building in a place that had particular requirements. I told him about the women. There had been 11 in the past year. Different circumstances, different amounts of time needed, different destinations afterward. What they had in common was the thing my mother had found when she arrived here with broken ribs and nowhere else to go. The knowledge that somewhere in the world there was a door that would open. I liked to think he could hear me. The 3 maple trees I had planted beside his stone were growing with the dark-soiled urgency of everything that grew within the grid's influence. By next spring, the tallest would be above my head. In a decade, they would shade the stone completely. In a generation, they would be the kind of trees that people assumed had always been there. I opened my notebook and wrote the date at the top of the first empty page. Then I looked out at the waterfall for a long time before I began. A year ago, I stepped off a Greyhound bus in Ridge Creek, Montana, with a suitcase and $300 in the name of a dead woman I had never met. I came because I had nowhere else to go. I stayed because what I found here turned out to be what I had been looking for, without knowing I was looking for it, not the land or the legal resolution of a conflict that had been running longer than I had been alive. I found the thing I had stopped believing existed when I was 4 years old and standing in a hospital hallway while strangers sorted out what to do with me. I found where I belonged. Not because belonging was something that had been waiting for me here like an inheritance, because belonging is not a thing you find, it is a thing you build. Eleanor understood that. She had built it in this valley over 40 years in the grid she maintained, and the people she helped, and the evidence she preserved, and the search she refused to abandon for a girl she had never met but had always loved. And then she had found me with 8 months left to live, and the particular stubbornness of someone who had been told no by people with more resources than her for 4 decades and had never accepted it as a final answer. She found me, and she handed me the keys, 3 rusted pieces of metal on a simple ring, cold in the palm, heavy with years I had not lived but was now living. I looked at the waterfall for a long time without writing. The mist was catching the morning light in the way it always caught morning light in this clearing, making the brief rainbows that appeared and vanished and appeared again. The same light show it had been performing every clear morning for thousands of years before anyone was here to see it, and would continue performing for thousands of years after we were all gone. It did not need us to be beautiful, but we needed it to be here. That was what Eleanor had understood. That was what the people who had built the living grid had understood centuries before her. That the relationship between a community and the land it depends on is not one of ownership. It is one of obligation. You protect what sustains you, not because it belongs to you, but because you belong to it, because you are one iteration in a long chain of people who have stood in this place and understood that some things require tending by whoever is present and capable of tending them. I was present. I was slowly becoming capable. I bent my head and began to write. Behind me in the cabin, a woman who had arrived 3 days ago was drinking coffee at Eleanor's kitchen table and looking out the window at the clearing with the particular expression of someone beginning to believe that they might be safe. Her children were asleep in the bedroom. The wood stove was burning steadily. The door was locked from the inside. Somewhere on the access road, Walt's truck was making its way toward the cabin for his Sunday morning visit, driven by a man who had decided a long time ago that showing up was the most important thing he could do with the portion of his life that was available for decision. Somewhere in the town of Ridge Creek, Vera Sutton was probably already awake, probably already deciding what to bring, probably already composing in her mind the particular story she would tell today about Eleanor, the one she had saved for a moment when it would land correctly. Somewhere in the valley, in the dark soil of the grid water, was moving through channels that had been carved by people who understood that the future was something you built for, not something that simply arrived. The waterfall ran. The mountain stood. The maples beside my brother's stone reached for the spring light with the urgency of things that know exactly what they are doing and have every intention of continuing. I rode until the sun had fully cleared the eastern peaks and the rainbows in the mist had made their morning appearance and gone. I wrote about what I had learned and what I was still learning, and what I expected I would spend the rest of my life learning in this clearing beside this waterfall, in this valley that had been waiting through 40 years and three generations of people trying to take it apart for someone to come and finally stay. I rode until the truck came up the access road, and Walt called out from the clearing in the particular voice he used when he wanted to announce himself without shouting. And I closed the notebook and stood up from my rock and walked back toward the cabin through air that tasted like pine and cold water, and the particular quality of a spring morning that will not be repeated. I had been named after the light that comes after darkness. I was learning slowly to become it.